This is part 2 of Foner, chapter 22, Fighting for the Four Freedoms. This is America in World War II. During World War II, new outlooks developed of what America should be like, should do in the future. For instance, there was the conservative outlook by Henry Luce, who believed that a future America and a future world should be based on free enterprise, material abundance. America should be the world's dominant power, spreading democracy and free enterprise. There was a New Deal liberal version by Henry Wallace, who believed that there should be international cooperation, no one nation in charge, and that there should be a global New Deal where America would help save the world from poverty. During the war, a National Resources Planning Board hoped to plan for the post-war economy. Its goals and principles were simple: economic security, an expansion of the welfare state, mass consumption, and an emphasis on government spending to help boost the economic activity of the country. Unions, civil rights groups, and religious groups were all very strongly behind the board. Congress, however, hated it, wanting to stop the New Deal and cut its funding drastically. What Roosevelt did manage to get through was a variety of economic bills of rights that were meant to secure full employment at home, a reasonable income, medical care, education, and a decent home for all Americans. Now, the broad economic Bill of Rights did not pass in Congress, but the ideas behind it were brought to at least partial fruition in the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, the GI Bill of Rights of 1944. This idea of helping people within the principles of the New Deal was fulfilled, but for returning veterans from the war, not for people in general. So there would be money for veterans to help with unemployment, college tuition. They would get low-cost mortgage loans, help with pensions, and job training. The GI Bill was fantastic because it put 1 million servicemen into college, and it spurred a suburban construction boom as these people came back, got jobs, and wanted to move out of the cities into the suburbs. There was a full employment bill, which Truman, by this point in 1946, wanted to get passed, and it would mean to spread to all Americans the benefits of the GI Bill. But Congress passed a watered-down version where the commitment to full employment was removed, as well as a government-sponsored job creation program. The reason why Roosevelt and then Truman were having so much trouble getting any type of New Deal laws passed is because of the growth of conservative opposition to the New Deal and the renewal of economic conservatism. Specifically, people like Friedrich Hayek, who wrote The Road to Serfdom in 1938, argued that economic problems in America, the failure to achieve full economic potential, had a lot to do with government interference in the economy. For instance, he argued, Hayek, economic planning was a threat to liberty. The free market was the only way to guarantee both an expanding economy, which was too complex to regulate, but also democracy, because it kept the government out of anything that it shouldn't be a part of. This idea laid the basis for modern conservatism, even though Hayek specifically was not as, whose book came out in 1944, Hayek was not as extreme as modern-day conservatives. He still believed that a minimum wage and maximum work hours were critical. But he did argue that the New Deal, with its heavy government regulation, was no different than the socialism of Russia or the fascism of Germany and Italy. And this was an idea which continued down to the modern day. Another aspect of World War II I want to talk about is race and ethnicity in America. During the war, there was a discrediting of ethnic and racial inequality. If freedom was the wartime goal, it discredited American racism and intolerance. Ethnic Americans specifically were now recognized as loyal Americans, and the status of blacks in America could no longer be ignored. For ethnic Americans, there was a broad assimilation. They were brought into the army and the industrial workforce. The war forced ethnics to leave their urban Little Italys and Little Chinas, etc., and their rural isolation, and to mix with other people in the army and in industry. After the war, and even during the war, many folks moved out of their original places to find new work, and thus also mixing with people outside of their own ethnic group. A consequence of this mixing of peoples, as opposed to people being locked in their communities, meant there was a shift in the definition of Americanization, which was all about everybody contributing. Not everybody had to be a specific way, white, Protestant, middle class, etc., which was the defining characteristic of World War I patriotic initiatives. There was a promotion of pluralism across all levels. In the government, the FDR promoted cultural pluralism, meaning all people who contributed to the American war effort were Americans, and there was no racial distinction. There was pamphlets that the government put out that highlighted how much the Italians and the Chinese and the Japanese and the Germans were all doing to help America win the war. Scholars increasingly denounced racism and nativism, or the hatred of immigrants, both of which lost their intellectual respectability. It was no longer acceptable for anybody, in the elite and the intellectual elite as well, to be even mildly intolerant. And even Hollywood began releasing all types of movies showing all ethnic groups, racial groups, contributing to the war effort. But there were ongoing barriers to assimilation, which is anti-Semitism, one of them. There was still a pronounced discrimination against Jews in America, and FDR, for instance, only allowed 21,000 Jews to seek refuge in the U.S., even though he knew Jews were being targeted in Europe by the Nazis. And of course there was racism. The idea of accepting blacks as equals were still a barrier to moving forward. And other non-white peoples, Mexicans, Asians, Native Americans, all felt incredible barriers to moving their conditions forward. Mexican Americans, for instance, prior to the war had been deported from the Southwest because of a lack of any real labor and fear that they would take it away from whites. Then during the war you had the Bracero program, which was a change in policy, allowed 4.5 million Americans to work legally in the U.S. because there was a need for their labor. Of course, they could never become citizens, and were easily deported, and could never join unions. On the other hand, many of these people who did have children in the U.S. created the second generation of Mexican Americans who did take part of all of the benefits of American citizenry, and you had the development of now a permanent Chicano culture in the South and in the Southwest. And many of the second generation Mexican Americans left their original ethnic neighborhoods and further assimilated with the rest of the country. But there were problems with this increase in Mexican migration. There were riots, the Zoot Suit riots in 1943, as there was a growing number of Mexican American youth on the streets of Los Angeles. There was still discrimination. They were held to the lowest skilled jobs. They were paid less than whites. But Mexican Americans now, in keeping with many other groups during the 30s and in World War II, were fighting back more than ever before. Because of the heightened civil rights consciousness, because of the wartime rhetoric on freedom and equality, Mexican Americans recognize now is a time to push and legally challenge workplace discrimination. American Indians similarly left their homes by the thousands and joined the military, the war industry, and thus assimilated and mixed with other peoples, becoming more broadly American with their own distinctive cultural qualities. During the war, it offered many American Indians the first experiences of urban life, of industrial work, and many of them choose not to return to the reservations. Some joined up the military, and when they came back, took advantage of the GI Bill, going to colleges and moving to cities and suburbs and not returning back to their reservations. Chinese Americans also benefited somewhat from the war. China was now an ally against Japan, and so the racial stereotypes of Chinese Americans eased as a consequence. Moreover, Congress partially lifted the immigration ban from China, though it only allowed very few Chinese to immigrate to America. But the Chinese were in the military, in the war industries. They fought in the war, not necessarily in the Pacific, more in the European and African theaters. They left their ethnic neighborhoods to work alongside whites and further assimilated into mainstream American culture, though again, maintaining their cultural distinctiveness. Japanese Americans had a tough time in World War II because of the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Empire of Japan. Propaganda portrayed them as animals, subhuman, a violent race of people that had to be eliminated. In 1942, the American government created an internment policy in order to house Japanese Americans away from the coast for fear that they might be selling secrets to the Japanese Empire. They were sent to internment camps. Their civil liberties, their property rights were eliminated. Nobody complained about this. The fear and the racism against the Japanese was such that the press didn't complain about the internment program, or the Communist Party, the NAACP, the American Jewish Committee, all groups that fought for civil rights, stayed quiet about this issue, both because of the impact of war propaganda and possibly simply racism. Even the Supreme Court affirmed that the federal government had a right to intern the Japanese in the 1944 case of Korematsu versus United States. Here are some of the posters which depicted the bestiality of the Japanese soldiers that the U.S. were fighting against. Here are internment camps and their locations in the United States where Japanese Americans were housed forcefully during the war. The response of Japanese Americans were varied. Some protested the war draft that drafted them to fight, though again not in the Pacific theater of war, but in the Europe and North African theater of war. But many did join the war in order to prove their loyalty to America. Eventually, Congress recognized how wrong it was to intern these people, and finally apologized in 1998 and offered compensation to the survivors. For African Americans, World War II was a big deal. There was accelerated migration to the industrial heartland. 700,000 people left the South for industrial jobs in the North and West. This is even more than World War I. Consequently, they faced a hostile reception. For instance, the Detroit race riot in 1943 against the influx of blacks and black laborers. There was also persistence of lynching throughout the World War II era, in spite of the fact that this war was being fought on behalf of freedom against a racial genocide regime, which was Nazi Germany. 1 million blacks joined up to fight in the war. But again, they served in segregated units, as in all previous wars. World War II also exploded a civil rights movement. A. Philip Randolph, a labor leader, threatened a march on Washington because FDR, with his expanding war industries, allowed them to segregate the jobs available to just whites. He wanted the war industries that were expanding to offer jobs to blacks on an equal basis. And he threatened to march on Washington in 41 to force FDR to do this. FDR responded with an executive order that banned discrimination in the defense industries. So, essentially, if you were buying weapons that the government was ordering, you had to hire blacks. And that was a presidential executive order. This led to 1 million blacks getting access to defense jobs and was a significant boost to the creation of the eventual black middle class, and it was the economic origins of the civil rights movement that expanded and exploded in the 50s and 60s. In the World War II, as a consequence of all this focus on civil rights and black access, the NAACP also exploded from 50,000 to 500,000 members. The Congress of Racial Equality also developed and expanded and started pushing for the integration of restaurants and theaters throughout the country. Organized labor also benefited from World War II. While the AFL continued to exclude black workers, the CIO actively sought to organize black workers. In the Double V campaign, blacks and whites saw freedom differently. Whites saw it as something to defend, blacks as something that still had to be achieved. For blacks, World War II, in spite of their access to jobs in the industrial industry, in spite of the fact that the CIO was in fact actively recruiting them, they felt the war was about victory over racism abroad, but also victory over racism at home. There was some progress. In spite of the fact that there was the beginning of a Southern massive resistance to civil rights, because of the growth in black assertiveness, there were changes. There was movement forward, however small, however slow, in civil rights. In the government, racial wage differentials were banned. You had to pay people the same wage, regardless of race. The Supreme Court outlawed all white primaries for parties to pick their presidential candidates. In the armed forces, the Navy ended segregation, and the Army created integrated combat units. In the New Deal, racial justice was now part of the agenda. It wasn't just about full employment. It was about full employment and civil liberties and the expansion of the welfare state. New Dealers were now calling for an end to lynching, for equal opportunity in the workplace, for an expansion of Social Security to cover farm and domestic workers. This formed the bridge to LBJ's drastic expansion of social welfare in the Great Society of the 1960s. American blacks also started connecting their struggle for civil rights to the struggle for international freedom from colonial empires, and thus was born black internationalism. American blacks saw racism at home as parallel to the colonial people's struggle against colonialism abroad, the colonial empire specifically of Africa, and their struggle against European control was seen as a broad struggle of all blacks globally against white oppression. The war wound down by end of 44, beginning of 45. In Europe, the last major battle where the Germans had an advantage, the Battle of the Bulge, was defeated in December of 44 and immediately afterwards. In March of 45, the Allies invade Germany, east and west, and Hitler commits suicide. By May 8th, war in Europe is over. In the Pacific, the continued advance of U.S. forces towards Japan continued without a break. All the islands along the way, big and small, were conquered. Guam, Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal. The bombing of Japan's homeland continued. And then, FDR dies in 1945, April. After he won re-election in 1944 with Harry Truman as his vice president, he dies in April of 45, and Harry Truman of Missouri immediately becomes president. Truman, who was kept in the dark of many of Roosevelt's war policies, was now thrust into a position where he had control of the world's strongest military and economic power, and he was given very little training for this position beforehand. One of the first things that he realized was that as the war was winding down in the Pacific, America had an atomic bomb. It had been developing it throughout World War II in New Mexico, and it was finally perfected in July of 45. Truman decided to use the atomic bomb on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. His thinking? Use the bomb to finally end the war, because the Japanese will not surrender, especially once Americans are on their homeland. Plus, he wanted to send a signal to the Soviet Union, to communist Russia, that Americans had this power, and in post-war planning, the Russians should be careful how much they demanded. Hiroshima was bombed on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th. The devastation was immediate. 70,000 dead in each city. Long-term radiation killed another 70,000 more in Hiroshima by December, and Nagasaki thereafter. Japan surrenders 1 week later. Here are pictures of the bomb, the wreckage in the cities, and the atomic burns suffered by the dead and by the survivors. There was a lasting controversy over the use of the bomb. Some say it was justified to save American lives. Others said that Japan was going to surrender soon enough anyway. There was no reason to use the bomb. But the use of the atomic bomb was not a surprise to many. During World War II, armies on both sides bombed civilian targets. Genocide was used by some as part of a war aim. Attacking civilian targets had become common to both sides of the war effort. And so bombing these cities with the atomic bomb was not a completely novel idea. It also made sense to many, since American propaganda had depicted the Japanese as inhuman, bestial, insect-like, and they should be eliminated as an exterminator exterminates bugs. After the war, and near the end of the war and immediately afterwards, post-war planning divided the Allied powers of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. What bound them together during the war, a common enemy, papered over the facts that they had very little in common. Britain and the United States were democracies and capitalist nations. The Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship. These were unresolvable conflicts. Now, during the war, the leaders of all three met at Tehran in Iran, Yalta in Russia, and Potsdam in Germany. They tried to plan for the post-war, but there was always tensions. The Russians felt that the West were delaying their invasion of Europe and thus leaving the Russians to take the brunt of the fighting against the Germans. The West, or the Allies, also distrusted the Russians in the East. The West felt that they were fighting Nazi Germany in order to liberate all of Europe, but in the East of Europe, the Russians were setting up communist puppet regimes, and the promised elections in Poland never happened. There was some positive planning, for instance, about the new economic order after World War II. In New Hampshire at Bretton Woods in July of 1944, America helps establish the economic order of the post-war world. They can do this because they have replaced Britain as the world's financial power. The dollar replaces the British pound as the central currency in global trade. It is relinked to the price of gold, and other currencies are linked to the value of the dollar. And there is a creation of a variety of industries that helps regulate global economic commerce, such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. The World Bank helped fund the rebuilding of Europe and developing countries, and the IMF kept countries from devaluing currency as during the Depression, and thus helped keep trade fair and free, which is what the U.S. still does today, or as fair and as free as possible. The United Nations was also created near the end of World War II. It was the successor of the League of Nations. Its planning took place at Dumbarton Oaks outside of Washington, D.C. in 1944. 51 nations joined, accepting the United Nations Charter. It agreed to outlaw force or threat of force as a means of settling international disputes. It was made up of a General Council of all nations and a Security Council of 6 rotating members and 5 permanent ones. The permanent ones being the U.S., Britain, Soviet Union, China, and France. The Senate endorsed the United Nations in making America part of a global peacekeeping structure, unlike what it did after World War I when it rejected the League of Nations. In conclusion, there was now peace at the end of World War II, but not harmony. Germany and Japan were totally defeated, as was Italy. But Britain and France, though victorious, were exhausted. Only the U.S. and Russia remained as international great powers after World War II. But their distrust would eventually solidify into a Cold War. But, finally, talks of universal freedom would reverberate in the post-Cold War era, since World War II was a struggle for freedom. It would be a rallying cry of civil rights struggles in the U.S. and anti-colonial struggles abroad.